Please Call Me Marlou is a one-woman performance of the noted Jungian analyst Louise von Franz, written and performed by Berry Tschinkel, a Jungian analyst in private practice in New York City. This performance was last seen at the Charleston Jung Society in November of 2017. It was adapted from the 2017 Gradiva award-winning play, The Women, Our Psychoanalytic Mothers, conceived by artistic director and psychoanalyst Louise DaCosta. The play, The Women, was co-written and performed by a select group of female analysts interested in recognizing women who were neglected pioneers in psychoanalytic history. The following segment is part of the performance, Please Call Me Marlou, where Berry Tschinkel reflects on Louise von Franz. Louise was a very complicated woman. I called this particular performance, Please Call Me Marlou, because her intimates, and there were many people who loved her, they called her Marlou. And that was obviously a shortened version of Marie Louise, but it also is a Swiss diminutive term for, I think, little one. And so her dearest called her Marlou. That was one side of her. The other side was quite a brilliant and often forbidding character. She had this fierce intellect and brilliant brain, and she was extremely heady. So there are many stories about how little she really inhabited her body. And how shocking it often was to people around her that she could lecture for 2 hours and barely move. I studied her tapes, watching her, and she had very kind of blocky, choppy movements. She was not at ease in her body. She was very much in her head. She was a thinking type. And if you know Jungian typology, Jung divided people into various different ways of orienting both to themselves and to the world around them. And there was the introvert-extrovert designation. There was thinking and feeling. There was intuitive and sensate, and judging and perceiving. And Louise was very definitely a thinking type. In fact, there are many stories about how Jung encouraged her to get a dog because she was so in her head and so little in her own body, that he thought a dog would sort of soften her and help her get more in touch with her instinctual life. So she got this bulldog, and she named him after Winston Churchill, and she called him Nibby. And Nibby was the love of her life. She loved Nibby. And she really counted on Nibby. He came with her to all of her sessions. And there were many times that she could be unduly harsh with someone, maybe give them an insight or an amplification, and in the doing of that, she would be harsh with them, unfeeling, even unkind. And Nibby would run across the room and either lick their leg or cuddle up beside them or even jump in their lap. And she would sort of chuckle a bit and say, "Oh, I guess I've neglected my feeling function." And she was notorious for that. One of the stories that I just read lately is that at her funeral, there was a very lavish buffet of good food and good wine. And she had provided for that before she died. She provided the funds and picked out what she wanted to serve. And many of the people who knew and loved her chuckled and said, to the very end, she was working on what's called her inferior function, her feeling function. She really worked hard to develop that because that was so lacking in her. Another story is that she often would not know the right thing to say or think of anything to say in a social situation where she needed expressions of condolences or even sort of greetings. And so she memorized appropriate responses to certain situations so that she would have those things at hand and so that she could be more socially appropriate. because she was not. As I also have sort of talked a little bit about, she could be unkind, not really intending to be, but just quite blunt. I read a story of a young man who used her as his thesis advisor. One of the things that you do when you do Jungian training is you do what's called a final project. And it's something you spend a year or more on. It's quite similar to a dissertation, except it's like a dissertation. I guess it's something that you want to do which furthers Jungian theory or thinking. He had spent a year on his paper, and he took it to her and left it at her house, came back a few weeks later, and he sat for a while waiting for her, and she made him wait. And then she came into the room, and she had his paper in her hand. It was a big, thick paper. And she looked at him, and she dropped it in the garbage. And he was devastated. And she just said, start over. And he did. And he wrote about this and said that he got a much, much better paper. And he realized afterwards that she was right, that it was full of hot air. But she was tough. And people both loved that about her, but it was exceedingly hard. Marie-Louise idealized Jung, especially in the beginning of their relationship. She was 18 and he was 57, and she was very much in awe of him. And he was a genius, an extremely brilliant mind, very creative mind, and had, tremendous numbers of facts and figures at his fingertips, and could synthesize all this information and just talk extemporaneously for hours at a time. And so she very much idealized him. She was the youngest of the women around him, and many considered her to be the most brilliant, certainly the most prolific, but also the most brilliant. And Jung really counted on her. She served very valuable purposes for him. She translated all these alchemical texts. She wrote. She was at his side a lot. She assisted him in the last 4 of the books he wrote. And he wanted to co-list her as, co-authoring them with him. But the people around him pitched such a fit, and there was so much jealousy, and it stirred so much controversy, that he had to go to her and say, Marie-Louise, I can't list you as co-author. It would just cause too much difficulty. She was very disappointed, but she did accept it, because Jung at that point in his life was in very poor health, and he didn't think he could stand the controversy. So she was very close to him, and she spent enormous amounts of time with him. And she listened deeply to many things he told her. For example, getting a bulldog or getting a dog. She listened and she got a bulldog. At a certain point in her life, he told her that he did not think analysts should live alone, that he thought being a psychoanalyst was very difficult emotionally, psychologically, and that to keep one's bearings, you really needed, a home life. You really needed to do the sort of mundane things of life, cooking and talking to another over dinner. And so he encouraged her to move in with Barbara Hanna, who was another Jungian analyst around him. She was 20 years von Franz's senior, and from all indications, another very, very smart woman. She was English, but they quarreled a lot. And yet they lived together for, I think, over 20 years. And they both were in Bollingen and in their apartment in Zurich. And they became lifelong companions. And Marie-Louise cared for her devotedly until she died. One of the things that I find notable in doing my research around Marie-Louise was maybe the youngest woman surrounding Jung, but Jung was surrounded by women. They loved him, and there were multiple reasons. One is he was a very good-looking man. He was tall and nicely built and extremely charismatic, brilliant man. He was considered a genius, and he loved women. And he, more than that, thought that the feminine in our culture had been neglected. Not only, and of course women at that time were second-class citizens. They did not have the opportunities or the encouragement. They did not have ways to achieve, many outside, marriage and family and children. But women from all over the world came to learn from Jung, to be around him, and he greatly encouraged them. And more than just encouraging these women individually and personally, he also thought that as a society, we had neglected what he thought of as, our feminine values, caring and, and being in touch with our feelings and appreciating beauty and respecting nature and, helping out mankind. These were all values that he looked around and said, we have a deeply patriarchal system at hand and it's not working for us. Jung and Freud had by all accounts, a father-son kind of relationship. They met when Jung was a fairly young man. He had read Freud and he started corresponding with Freud because Jung was in Zurich and Freud was in Vienna. And the legend goes that their first meeting, they talked for 13 hours nonstop. And there was such a meeting of the minds, there was such a deep connection and such a shared fascination with the unconscious and with human nature that they just couldn't get enough of each other. As we all know, over time, as Jung became clearer and clearer about his own thinking process and how his ideas differed from Freud, he and Freud began to have a fair amount of conflict. In fact, so much so that they really split in 1913, and Jung was out. Fundamentally, Freud and Jung's understanding or conception of the unconscious was very different. In Jungian theory, we believe that the unconscious is a vast, unexplored aspect of self where one finds untapped potential, creativity, obviously memories, but where the rich storehouse of most aspects of the self need to be sort of mined, developed, explored. It's a landscape that you are taught as a Jungian to really travel within. Freud thought of the unconscious as more a repository of repressed wishes and desires. It was sort of where you put things that you didn't want to think about, the kind of icky stuff. And so dreams, for example, in a Freudian context would be that they gave you an idea of what you weren't allowing yourself to think about. Well, we believe that as Jungians too, that often your dreams can show you aspects of your unconscious that you've repressed. But as Jungians, we believe it's far, far greater than that. Another area of difference, and one that's pretty fundamental, is that Jung believed, like the sexual instinct, the instinct for power and aggression, that we all have a religious instinct. He said that he looks across all cultures throughout time, and every civilization has some form of spirituality or religion. And so he thinks that as mankind, womankind, we have a religious instinct that we need to honor. He did not think you had to have a religion per se, although he did say that whatever religion that you were raised in became a fundamental aspect of who you were, and you needed to make peace with that. But he believed that we all had a need for a spiritual aspect of self to be explored and developed. He differed greatly from Freud in that Freud really felt that the sexual instinct was the most powerful instinct we had. Jung did not believe that. He thought that was one of many instincts: the hunger instinct, the power instinct, the religious instinct, the instinct really for beauty, for creativity. He believed we had these various instincts that equally had power, like one's sexual instinct. I was drawn to Jungian analysis because I thought it is a much more hopeful psychological orientation. I work with all sorts of people in my practice, people who have high anxiety, people who are depressed, people who have marital issues or relationship problems, people who are in the second half of life and just unhappy, don't know where they want to go. People in the first half of life who really struggle with finding their way. I think Jungian analysis can help many different kinds of people because it really requires you to develop a relationship with your own unconscious. So you work a lot with your dream life. You work a lot with your fantasies. You work a lot in the transference process. And you really begin to discover that there's both this very conscious part of yourself that we often know, oh, I'm going to get up today and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and this more unconscious part of you where I got derailed and I didn't do one thing I was supposed to do. What happened there? And by really learning to work with your unconscious, you learn that we are really subject to forces much larger and deeper than our willpower, and that those forces really do shape our lives. And I find this incredibly powerful and also hopeful, because I don't feel as though you need to be at the mercy of unconscious forces if you will take the time to get to know yourself on that level. Like any other field of work, probably each Jungian analyst has their own style, the things that most speak to them in the theory, what they value the most. I would say that probably across the board, in most, at least early analysis, you are working with what's called the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow is a term in Jungian psychology which really is it's both a complex and a simple term. It refers to those aspects of yourself that you don't like or that you don't even know you have. For example, if you are very argumentative, you don't listen well, you are constantly sort of making problems in your friend group or at work or in your intimate relationships, you can't get along with people. Your work in early analysis would be looking at what that's all about, how that developed, what purpose it serves, because as Jungians we believe that there is both a positive and a negative to everything. There's an upside and a downside to everything. But you would really be looking at your shadow self and working hard on confronting it. And that means not defensively, not pretending that you're not something, but really looking honestly at who you are and trying to change what you can change and learning to accept what you can't change. So that early part of psychoanalysis is a very important part, and many people, if they've done even that part, have done a very, very valuable piece of work in their lives.